Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, which is a humanist congregation. And this is Coffee and Wisdom, a humanist perspective on theological questions. For the past several weeks, we have been looking at theological views of animals. I do want to look this week at the animal and human future together. But the first question that occurs to me concerning that is how do we talk about the past? Because, we've had some animals on this planet for a little bit longer than humans have been around. So, how to communicate the time scale of life on Earth? Researchers at UCLA and the University of Wisconsin-Madison have confirmed that microscopic fossils discovered in a nearly 3.5 billion year old piece of rock in Western Australia are the oldest fossils ever found, and indeed the earliest direct evidence of life on Earth, runs a headline. And so, yes, we now know what some of the earliest forms of life probably looked like. Although, how long had the evolution already been going on? This is always an interesting question as we delve into it. The Oxford Dictionary defines the timeline as a graphic representation of the passage of time as a line. And the concept of how a timeline works is kind of interesting, I think, and it does have implications for how we see things. So we can draw timelines up and down and across, vertically, horizontally. We can even do timelines in a circular fashion, which is kind of interesting, as we shall see in a moment. They are everywhere. Some of them are so complicated, it takes a magnifying glass to actually read what they have to say. You can even communicate more than a couple of pieces of information on a timeline by putting in further intricacies within the timeline itself. They've been around for quite a while. We can see some very simple ones from the early 20th century, especially Old Testament, quote unquote, timelines that were trying to communicate how long people had been on the earth. Well, and that's one of the questions and problems with a timeline. The earth is probably around 4.5 billion years old. That origin of life somewhere around 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. And then we have this huge stretch of time in which we have evolution going on, but plants and animals don't come along until very, very late on the timeline. So how do we communicate how all of this works? It even gets more complicated when we try to look at something as incredibly long ago, if you can look at it that way, in terms of the Big Bang. You'll just do a little bit of web searching for Big Bang timelines, and you're going to find all kinds of graphic representations of that long time. Also, if we're talking about evolution, how do we communicate a timeline in which we not only have the animals, the living things evolving, but we also reflect the warming and the oxygen and the CO2, et cetera? How do we talk about those in terms of how they affect evolution? Can we even do that in a graphic way is the question. Well, who invented the timeline? Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived somewhere around 260s, 265, 339 of the Common Era, is usually credited with having invented the idea of a timeline. You say, oh, wait a minute, that's not all that long ago. When we talk about mathematics, when we talk about Aztec calendars, that's just not that long ago. Well, that's one of the interesting things about the concept of the timeline. What he did, actually, he didn't draw a timeline because this is before the printing press. He cannot do graphic design very well. So he writes it as a list, starting with the capture of Troy. Now, How historically true is the capture of Troy is another question. And yeah, that's one of the problems with timelines is where's your truth to the history that you're dealing with? Joseph Priestley, who, yes, and discovered oxygen, a great mathematician and a Unitarian. Joseph Priestley published a new chart of history in 1769. Now, this one is really credited with being one of the first ones that looks like a timeline as we would understand it today. We see the Roman Empire being in kind of the central location of Joseph Priestley's timeline. And again, this is part of the question of how to do one. There are very few books about the timeline and the concept of how to do one. One of the few is Cartographies of Time, A History of the Timeline by Daniel Rosenberg and Anthony Grafton. A fascinating book full of wonderful illustrations if you're really, really into the question of how timelines developed and how the conceptual idea develops over time. So, is time linear or cyclical? This is one of the central questions of a timeline. Yeah, there are timelines that are circular, but they're also going up or to a more recent time. But we know that the ancient peoples did see time as in a linear fashion. So it is us, it is our concept of time that is being reflected in the idea of a timeline. And where did Eusebius get that idea? Well, because Christians began to think of time as having been split between the before the birth of Jesus Christ and the time after the death of Jesus Christ. So we have before Christ, BC, and Anno Domini, after the life of Christ. Uh, and most people don't use those terminologies anymore because they are highly reflective of a particular religious tradition. But Christianity did take over Europe, and so this idea did really get into the thinking and the writing of Europeans. So if you do the AD-BC split and you don't know about evolution, one of the things you've got is a fairly simple timeline. History before Abraham. Especially, it's easy if you begin the history of everything at 404 BC, before the birth of Jesus. So we're talking about a time span of only 6,000 years if we're looking at it from that perspective. Old Testament timelines are a favorite if you want to start looking at the history of printing and timelines. Before Abraham, before Jesus, when does Genesis occur? When do the people leave Egypt, et cetera, et cetera? Well, how did we get from that secular view of time to this idea that there is an arrow of time? Well, one of the ways we got there was the continuing ideas of what time zones meant over time. Now, what happens with the advent of train travel? Suddenly, people began to see that the old way of doing time, that it's noon everywhere, did present some problems. And with the invention of the steam locomotive, time and distance become things that are together. If you're going to go 1,000 miles, what's going to be the time that you do that? And so thinkers begin to say, wait, what are we going to do with this? Well, the time zone started operating in November 18th of 1883, and that was in the U.S. because of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, then, if you're going to have this idea of time, then how do you communicate something longer than 4004 BC? Well, we have to start talking about billions of years ago. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that creates the problem that, the Earth has been around a very long time. Living things have been around a very long time, and human beings haven't been around all that long. If you start looking at how timelines try to communicate this huge length of time, there are all kinds of attempts out there to begin. Do we start at the Paleozoic? Do we start at the Mesozoic? And this becomes a real question of how we deal with the question of time. By the way, the idea of communicating the evolution of humanity is interesting in that it probably gave the created the idea of some kind of info communication, because we're talking about not only time passing, but also humans changing with time. Now, one thing you can do is just don't worry about all of that happening that happened before human beings. In some ways, this gets back to the original Old Testament look at how that worked. But we can be communicative of evolution as well. Prehistory, 3 million years ago. We're going to do it that way because now we're going to talk about just human history, and we're going to split that between prehistory and history. The problem with that is that it does communicate the idea that humanity only matters in so-called civilization. But we know that humanity had been developing for a heck of a lot longer than only 3 million years ago. Then we have some other ideas. Now, if we begin to think about the timeline as a reflection of a new understanding of time and distance, then what do we do with physics? And Stephen Hawking famously came up with another idea of time. He said, because imaginary time behaves like another direction in space, histories in imaginary time can be closed surfaces like the surface of the Earth with no existential beginning or end. And so Hawking creates the idea of imaginary time. In actual fact, yes, unmathematical minds like my own really don't quite get that, because real time and imaginary time are about communicating with mathematical formulas, and imaginary time then smooths out the concept of time so that it works with the Big Bang. I had to look that up. Exactly what is time.com is a very fascinating site online. It will reward your time taken to look at it. There they say this: despite its rather abstract and counterintuitive nature, the usefulness of imaginary time arises in its ability to help mathematically to smooth out gravitational singularities in models of the universe. Normally, singularities like those at the center of black holes or the Big Bang itself pose a problem for physicists because they are areas where the known physical laws just do not apply. When visualized in imaginary time, however, the singularity is removed and the Big Bang functions like any other point in space-time. And so you see the concept of time has to be then dealt with in various ways to make science work. Well, you can study, but here's a homeschooling for him book called How to Make a History Timeline Project for Kids, simple ideas you can do. And yeah, you can get very creative graphically with the idea of a timeline, important English literature. Well, that's all that long of a timeline, so you can make it into a graphically interesting bookcase, for example. We also do need to remember that timelines and how they are constructed communicate a great deal about the point. Here is a timeline for 10 important dates in Texas history, and you will notice that the time in history begins with the Spanish entering the area that will become Texas. Now, what does that communicate? Well, that's even a shorter time than biblical history. This is going to be dealing with Texas as a place where natives don't really matter within the larger time scale. And then we're going to communicate how we go from a Spanish possession of Texas to, yes, becoming a U.S. state. And as you see, that does communicate a very particular view of how it all worked. Well, That's kind of a short introduction to the idea of the timeline, because one of our problems here is that if we are looking at life, and we know that Darwin sets up this classic idea of time being a very, very long kind of construct so that evolution can take place. And then we have to look at what is a living thing and what is, of course, yes, our relationship with living things, when we now know, thanks to evolution, that we are part of that story. Thanks a lot for listening today, and we will be back on Thursday to take a look at where people come into the picture and how we and animals will probably exist into the future. And thanks a lot for listening today.